With this, we now move on to session 1, keynote speeches on global trends in Green ODA. The first session of the day will be moderated by Professor So-Young Chung, the Director of Center for Global Climate and Marine Governance of Korea University.
Thank you, Hae-yoon, for kind introduction. My name is So-Young Chung. I'm a professor at the Division of International Studies of Korea University, also directing the organizing the unit on campus, Center for Global Climate and Marine Governance. It's my pleasure to introduce several speakers, distinguished speakers in this session, keynote speech sessions on global trends in the Green ODA. We have speakers from the United States, and then Korea, based in Korea, GGGI and UNDP Seoul Policy Center, and then one from the San Francisco and others. So we have a very tight schedule today. So I just want to make sure that each speaker will keep your time of the presentation initially allocated for you. So let me first introduce the first speaker, Professor Louis Goodman of American University. So Louis, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, so floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So first I'm going to try to share the screen. So it's such a pleasure for me to participate in this important conference. As Ambassador An said, there are few international relations subjects more important than environmental cooperation. And I want to commend Korea University Center for Global Climate and Marine Governance for organizing this event. But to start out, I have to reveal a deep-seated bias. And that bias is that I'm a big fan of the Republic of Korea and also of Korea University. I've been a regular visitor to Korea and Korea University for many years. I witnessed both the difficulties following Korea's struggle with the 1997 Asian financial crisis and its super impressive and rapid recovery, followed by the United States precipitated 2008 global financial crisis. I remember when I first visited Korea University in 1992, it was hardly a green university with charcoal stoves heating most of its building, a far cry from the super impressive modern facilities it has today. I'm always so impressed when I visit Korea University. I want to talk today about two things, about the recent historical roots of Korea's Green ODA, and also about the kinds of partnerships that the Republic of Korea must forge in the future to assure the success of the Green ODA. Regarding the historical roots of Korea's Green ODA, I could remind everyone that by some measures, Korea has the greenest landscape tradition of any advanced country, with the least amount of water and artificial nutrients used per square meter. But I'd have to go way back in Korea's history to explain that. So I want to start with 12 years ago with Professor Lee Myung-bak's Green Energy Growth Plan. And to illustrate that, I have a chart that my dear colleague, So-Young Chung, developed. You can see his name there, charting the history of climate change policy in Korea. When President Lee announced his Green Growth Plan in 2009, it had three objectives. First, to move Korea to become a clean energy consumer. Second, to further establish a positive international presence for Korea. And three, to reignite Korea's economy following the global financial crisis. Starting with objective number 3, since 2009, Korea's economy has done extremely well. It has moved from number 17 in the world with a GDP of $727 billion to number 11 with a 2019 GDP of $1.75 trillion. Regarding number 2, Korea has an ever-increasing positive international presence, moving from number 22 globally on the University of Southern California's soft power ranking in 2016 to number 15 in 2019, this was the most notable rise of any advanced country. It has struggled, however, with objective number 1. It has had difficulty containing its energy consumption, and its consumption it has had difficulty making it less brown and more green. In that context, when President Moon Jae-in announced his Green New Deal post-COVID stimulus plan in 2020, it built upon the 2009 Green Energy Growth Plan, but it was far more sophisticated. The Green New Deal post-COVID stimulus plan has 3 strategic areas: green urban development, low carbon decentralized energy, and innovative green industry. It promises to invest $135 billion in green and digital technology and to generate more than 650,000 new jobs by 2025. Today, Korea is a green growth norm setter. Its green initiatives have placed Korea among the world's leading countries, specifically aiming, 1, to make their economies and societies both green and productive, 2, to use this as a base for enhancing their global competitiveness, and 3, to create a virtuous cycle of green global competitiveness and national prosperity. Of course, Korea cannot achieve these objectives by itself. These objectives require that Korea build partnerships with allies around the world to mainstream green growth initiatives in national economic policies. Among Korea's partner building initiatives in this regard is the relationship of its Korea Green Growth Trust Fund with the World Bank Group. The KGGTF website reports a fund of $138 million with 165 grants made to date in sectors including urban, transport, energy, ICT, environment, agriculture, and water, allocated in 5 continents worldwide. The website states that the KGGTF activities are, quote, strongly motivated by the awareness of risk created by climate change and a need for responsible management of natural resources. How successful can these and Korea's other green ODA activities be? That is a question I want to address. According to a June 2020 article in the Environmental and Development, in the journal Environmental and Development Economics, green ODA, aiming to mitigate carbon emissions, has a positive impact on countries when those countries have high quality partner institutions. And interestingly, these green ODA activities have a negative impact on carbon mitigation in countries with poor quality institutions. Further, it was found that green ODA is most effective in countries that enjoy economic freedom and are relatively free from corruption. This finding is, of course, consistent with decades of research on ODA and on NGO assistance to partners in developing nations in a broad array of sectors. Nevertheless, it warrants repeating here. Thus, with the Republic of Korea's increasingly sophisticated plans for creating a virtuous cycle controlling climate change, stimulating its economy, and changing environmental related values and customs, it will be essential for the Republic of Korea to work with partners, both national and institutional, that have high quality institutions. In other words, partners that practice good governance. What then is good governance? And here I have a slide from the United Nations. First, as a foundation, good governance requires, as was stated by the German sociologist Max Weber more than 100 years ago, that the state have a monopoly of the legitimate means of violence. That means the partners must be able to assure the physical well-being of its citizens and of their potential partners. With that foundation, good governance, with governance including all of the processes of governing a social system, whether it's undertaken by a government, of a state, by a market, or by a network, has 5 major characteristics. These are shown in the PowerPoint slide. Good governance is participatory, it is consensus-oriented, it is accountable, it is transparent, it is responsive, it is effective and efficient, it is equitable and inclusive, and it follows the rule of law. And if a country has good governance, that effectively assures that corruption is minimized, that the views of minorities are taken into account, that the voices of the most vulnerable in society are heard in decision-making, and that it is also responsive to the present and future needs of society. Therefore, in my view, for the Republic of Korea's well-conceived Green ODA to achieve its goals, it is thus essential that it work with partners that practice good governance and that avoid potential partners who do not. Following this practice will assure that the Republic of Korea's Green ODA has very bright prospects. I want to end here and thank you for the opportunity to share these views.
So let me just introduce the next speaker, Dr. Frank Riesberman, Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. And Frank, floor is yours.
Thank you, Sir John. Let me likewise try and share my screen. Yes. And make it full. All right. So I'll talk today likewise about Korea's Green ODA, and after the very positive words from Professor Goodman, I have a follow-up that is equally admiring of Korea, but I have some additional words. We are in the midst of a pandemic, but as some speakers have said, the climate crisis has not taken a day off. So we actually are in the middle of an unprecedented sustainability crisis as well. And while Korea has taken very strong action at home to green the recovery, Korea's current ODA is really not very green, as I'll show you. And my overall message is that Korea's ODA can adopt clear green targets in line with the Green New Deal and net zero. So I was very happy to hear from Koika earlier on that they do indeed plan to increase their Green New Deal ODA. But I think I'm going to show to you that that target that you heard about, the 11 or the 15%, is still very modest in my view. So yes, the sustainability crisis. Of course, we're focusing on COVID these days, but we have a climate crisis, we have a mass species extinction event, the 6th mass species extinction that many scientists fear for, and many other issues. Now, I've worked on environment and development issues for almost my entire career, the last 40 years, and during that time, I've very often heard people say things like these. Poor people, hungry people don't care about the environment. They have other more priority needs. And that is then often taken as a reason not to focus on environment in ODA, but to focus on what are perceived as other basic needs. Now, I will not deny that hungry people or refugees may not worry about global greenhouse gas emissions, but what is not really in doubt is that those same poor people in developing nations are extremely vulnerable to the climate crisis and to environmental pollution. The cyclone, for instance, Cyclone Ida that hit Southern Africa was devastating in Mozambique, and Mozambique has very limited capacity to then deal with the consequences. Mozambique, but also Zimbabwe suffered incredibly. And yes, the United Nations has told us that we are already seeing many millions of climate refugees, counting as many as 25 million in 2019. And almost always those are poor people in developing countries fleeing droughts or escaping floods, as you see here. So while I agree that poor people might have other priorities than greenhouse gas emissions, there is still a very strong reason to focus on increasing the resilience of people in developing countries to deal with climate change. I'd also like to bring up air pollution. Air pollution is, of course, the #1 environmental issue that worries people in Seoul, in Korea, and indeed in cities like where we live. It is our diesel buses, the coal-fired power plants that affect our air quality. And you might think that if you're a person living in rural Cambodia or Ethiopia, maybe you're not so worried about that. It's true you're not worried about that kind of air pollution, but a very large share of the premature deaths, the 7 million premature deaths every year due to air pollution, come from indoor air pollution. And you might be surprised to learn that in countries like Cambodia, as much as 80 to 90% of people cook on charcoal fires that cause incredibly bad indoor air pollution. And yes, it is possible through ODA to give people either better cook stoves or to give them access to renewable energy. And when we speak about renewable energy, we usually focus on its impact to lower greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has a huge potential to reduce that indoor air pollution that poor people suffer from in the developing countries. So I'd like you to think about ODA and of climate smart ODA, not just as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which indeed in the least developed countries where we work in are usually not that high to begin with, but to think of green ODA as a way to improve people's lives, fight poverty, and deal with those environmental or climate impacts that poor people suffer from. So what is ODA? And I'd like to just give you a bit of a perspective on the total numbers. Developed countries, OECD-DAC members, have agreed a long time ago that they really ought to give at least 0.7% of their gross national income in ODA. Sadly, as you can see in this graph, the actual ODA percentage given by OECD-DAC members has not gone up, it has gone down. That is the red line. It has gone down from 0.5% to an average of 0.3% today. The number in dollars has gone up, that's the blue line, and today we're talking about roughly $150 billion a year in ODA. If you know that the total amount of money mobilized for the green or for the recovery from COVID is about 10, 12 trillion dollars, you can also see that ODA is really a pretty small drop in the bucket that we provide to developing countries to deal with all their various challenges. Now, Republic of Korea's ODA, of course, it is still laudable that Korea has developed so quickly and joined OECD-DAC about 10 years ago. Its ODA target was about 0.2% for 2020, but in reality, the actual percentage has been about 0.15. That makes Korea the 25th highest donor in the world, and in terms of dollars, it's the 15th largest. So it is a significant donor. The percentage is a bit lower than average and quite a bit lower than the official target. Now, what is green ODA? We talk about green ODA, there isn't really much of a formal definition of green ODA, but the OECD-DAC, which is the official counter of how, if you like, green or how environmental ODA is, has been counting that since the early 90s. There was an environmental marker at that time, and in 1998, when we had the Rio conference, they added 4 more markers to deal with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity and diversification. But you have to realize that these 5 markers overlap in a big way, as you can see in this graph. So the amount of money going to the environment is often roughly the same money that goes to climate change, to biodiversity, etc. So yes, very much overlapping or intertwined, both in terms of the issues and in terms of the solutions. So how much money has gone to green ODA in the world? Roughly 1/3. So roughly $35 billion, or 31% of all ODA is counted as relevant for the environment. A relatively small amount actually goes to the environment as a sector, something like 3.7%. A bit larger amount is counted as aid that has environment as a principal objective, 7.3%. And then there is a larger amount where environment is one of the significant objectives. So together, it adds up to about $35 billion a year. And likewise, similar sums for aid supporting climate come up to about 26% of all. And you have to remember, a lot of that is overlapping with environment. Of course, there is a lot more climate finance going on. Much of it doesn't come from development aid, but an overall message that is very relevant for developing countries is that much of it is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and a much smaller amount is focused on helping poor people in developing countries adapt to climate change. While many organizations say that we should have at least half of the money going to adaptation, in practice, it is more a much smaller percentage. Of course, the overall amount of climate finance, and the world has promised developing countries that it would provide about $100 billion a year in climate finance. Most of that comes from the private sector, as you can see here, but only a very small part of that overall climate finance, the little bits of red, focus on adaptation. The bulk of it focuses on reducing emissions. So if you're poor and live in a developing country, only a pretty small slice of that climate finance is really relevant to you in helping you adapt to those floods and droughts that I talked about earlier. Where does Korea fit in? Well, Korea, in the counting of the OECD-DAC, committed about 10% of its bilateral aid, that is the aid not going to the UN, to environment. And that is about a third of the average of all DAC countries. So you can also see here, if KOICA would increase the total amount of its green ODA to about 15%, it would still only be half of the average. About 5% of Korea's ODA was focused on environmental issues as a principal objective, compared to 11% on average. For climate finance, the picture is even more skewed, if you like. Only about 7% of Korea's ODA was counted as climate change relevant, versus an average of 26. That's only about, that is about 4 times less than the average. Korea's finance did distinguish itself by being more adaptation focused than mitigation focused. So that is a bit different than what you see for other donors. If we compare Korea, if Korea wants to be a leader, if it doesn't want to compare itself with the average, but with leading donors, others that have Green New Deals as a key objective, then you see that actually most of the countries in Europe provide more than 40% of their aid as green ODA. And only the US is in a similar boat as Korea, only 7%, because a lot of the US development aid goes to rather different areas, if you like. That brings the average down as well. But if Korea wanted to compare itself with leading donors that provide a large share of their ODA as green ODA, then something like 40% would be a more, if you like, target in line with the rest. And if you look at the future, I think you can expect that in Europe, particularly, where there is also a Green New Deal, the trend is to rapidly increasing green shares of ODA. The European Investment Bank, for instance, counts itself as a climate finance pioneer, and it had a target of about 35% of all of its financing to developing countries to go to climate finance. And you can see in this graph a little bit what the kind of subjects are that they finance. There is currently an active discussion in the EU on how much the future development aid in their next 7-year budget should go to green ODA. And much of the discussion is to increase the target for the EU ODA to 50%. So 50% of all EU's ODA to be green as climate and environment spending. And in an interesting discussion paper I found from a large number of development partners in Europe, arguing with the Commission how to green their ODA, they mentioned both this 50% target, but also targets that at least 85% should have a gender equality objective, and to make sure that in addition to targeting a specific share of the ODA as green, that there are also policies to prevent harmful spending. And that is relevant for Korea because until at least very recently, Korea had green ODA, but it also financed coal-fired power plants in a number of countries as one of the key financiers of such projects. Now, last year we learned that KEPCO, after it made its last commitment to finance a power plant, a coal-fired power plant in Vietnam, will stop doing that. But it is indeed important to have policies to prevent harmful spending and to make sure that ODA also aligns with other international standards related to human rights, to social safeguards, and to criteria to exclude fossil fuels and environmentally harmful activities. So those would be three important trends or three important issues to discuss when we look at Korea's Green ODA. Overall targets, policies to prevent harmful spending, and standards to make sure that the overall quality of the ODA is indeed green. Well, I hope I don't have to convince you that there are many opportunities to have effective ODA that is green. Many, in fact. I mean, virtually everything that GGI does indeed would qualify as green ODA. And we believe that right now there are excellent opportunities to increase renewable energy, work on energy storage, on e-mobility, on energy efficient buildings, on nature-based solutions, all of those areas that should grow in KOICA's portfolio. Probably most important when we look at the green recovery or Green New Deals is that, of course, every country like Korea itself is extremely interested in the jobs that can be provided through those projects. And the good news is that we've looked at that at GSGI for a number of years, and we've looked at countries from Fiji to Uganda to Cambodia and concluded that there are many green jobs that can be created through investments, ODA in sustainable agriculture, but also in green manufacturing and in a series of areas that are all relevant for ODA. In fact, last year we came out with a study that showed that if Mexico, Indonesia, or Rwanda, a very different country, would implement the NDCs that they have committed to the Paris Agreement, they would create millions of green jobs. In other words, implementing the NDCs for the Paris Agreement is indeed a key priority action that can help with the green recovery as well. That's probably the most important news. But when you think of renewable energy and you think of these large fields of solar panels, it's good to know that when we talk about least developed countries, you can actually do projects that work with small-scale renewable energy, such as this project in Fiji, where GGI and the government installed solar panels on off-grid little hotels that allowed those little hotels to have solar freezers, which changes the business of those little hotels so they don't have to cook food fresh every day, but they can indeed use fridges and freezers, which is a way to add value to their business. In other words, renewable energy is not just energy. Renewable energy also has many other productive uses. And in Africa, for instance, we look at many projects where renewable energy is combined with irrigation for solar powered irrigation, which then also provides large numbers of green jobs. And we are very pleased that we have been able to convince quite a few of our partner donors to start funding green recovery projects, such as here in Senegal, that will focus on changing large pumps for irrigation from diesel or fossil fueled energy to solar energy, combined with climate smart agriculture, capacity building and training for small scale farmers. In other words, many opportunities for having green ODA that still focus on poverty, health, and other more traditional ODA targets, while being green, while increasing climate resilience of local communities. I think my time is about up, so I'll stop, but I wanted to share with you that we do have a very nice KOICA project along these lines in the Philippines, where we work with small-scale farmers to increase the value of their production in their calamansi, a bit like Jeju mandarins type citrus, and at the same time increasing their climate resilience and producing green jobs as part of the COVID recovery. Similar projects, particularly in nature-based areas, Korea has a very strong tradition in reforesting the country, and there are many opportunities to work with other countries. Here, a project I'm sharing in Peru, to work with small farmers to turn those small farmers from people that cut the trees down to becoming the stewards of the forest, by helping them to have better livelihoods and at the same time become stewards of their environment and help with the environment rather than be a cause of environmental destruction. Overall, we see quite a few opportunities for Green New Deal ODA, and here are the 6 key areas that GGI is working on, from just transition and green employment to working with ministries of finance on specific monetary and fiscal tools, all the way to working on fostering green public procurement. I don't have much time to take you through all these, but this is just to say there are a number of options to work directly on Green New Deal ODA that is relevant for our partner countries, and GGI is undertaking this year such Green New Deal work in 12 of our member countries with funding, including from Korea, for support for GGI. And yes, we've had many of our member countries ask, the Green New Deal, is that just for Europe or maybe for the US if President Biden gets his way, or for Korea, or is it relevant for developing countries as well? We do believe Green New Deals are relevant for developing countries also, and we've come up with a model Green New Deal that would bring about green recovery, large numbers of green new jobs, and probably the only big difference between the Green New Deal in Korea and those in most developing countries is that we'd have a larger focus on natural capital investment, on restoration of forests, and on climate smart agriculture. That would provide the bulk of the jobs compared to countries like Korea or other emerging or industrialized economies. So thank you. My conclusions are that yes, we have a COVID pandemic, but also a sustainability crisis. And poor people in developing countries are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change or air pollution. Korea's aid is not very green yet. Only some 10% supports the environment versus a much higher average, 40% for leading green ODA providers. And indeed, we hope that Korea could set a higher target. We learned that it is already planning to increase its target from 11 to 15%, but I would actually argue that it should be at least at 33%, that is the average for the DAC, or 40% if it wants to be a leading donor, or 50% if it wants to be in line with the EU and others who really focus on Green New Deal and net zero leadership. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. By Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director and Executive Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. Barbara, are you ready?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure being here. So let me also just try to share my screen. Let me just see. Okay, whether that works. Great. So thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone here. It's a true pleasure being with you today to discuss green financing. And again, let me thank so much to the organizers for inviting me here. I think this conversation today could not be happening at a more critical time, and I think we've heard that already from the previous speakers. What is very clear is that we live in times in which the COVID pandemic has laid bare the gaps in society and also the government's ability to address them in terms of social safety nets and big points in the economy impacting the world's most vulnerable. And I think Frank has done a very nice job in really kind of giving us an overview of where we are and what are some of the implications. Maybe just to add on that one, I think while COVID has terribly claimed so many lives, I think estimates from the experts around the world foresee that these numbers rise to the 100-fold over the next decade should the world continue post-COVID on a business as usual pathway that sees greenhouse gas emissions continue at their current level. So to build back, or as we say, to build forward better, we must ensure that climate action is embedded across recovery plans, which will be channeling billions into the economy in the coming years. And we've already heard from several speakers that Korea actually has been leading the way in Asia in green recovery with its Green New Deal, highlighting the critical role that investing in green can play in driving the economy and really trying to create jobs and boosting economic growth. But I think in parallel, ramping up green ODA commitments will be critical to support developing economies in parallel and really helping to achieve this green recovery. And again, I think the organizers have made a very nice job here in just basically putting me at this point of this conversation, because what I'm going to share with you in my presentation is really a little bit more on the broader picture of climate finance and showing you, how ODA sits within that and what are some of the opportunities. So now, very quickly, just about us, my organization, the Climate Policy Initiative. We have been at the forefront of bringing forth both policy and financial solutions for a green recovery. And we have been founded in 2009 to help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we are known basically as leaders in tracking sustainable investment trends, in identifying innovative business models, and supporting the solutions that can drive a transition towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. I think what we bring is really our unique focus on finance and our ability to get the right people to the table, and also our analytical rigor. And our partners, our financiers, our policymakers, and our other people whose decisions have a huge impact on whether investment is low or high carbon. And our work has been used or been endorsed by a number of governments, including those of India, Brazil, Indonesia, Southern Africa, and also the G7 countries. So let me just very briefly give you an overview of basically what we have been detecting in our work at CPI. We have been tracking investments into climate actions since 2011, and the latest edition of our Global Landscape of Climate Finance report, which basically provides a comprehensive overview of climate-related primary investment on a global level. So what Frank has shown is kind of a subset of climate finance, which is mostly the ODA part is really focused on investments into emerging economies. But again, it's not kind of a full global picture of where money is flowing. And our most recent report has shown that annual tracked global climate finance in 2017 and 2018 has crossed for the first time the $500 billion mark, and that is good news. This is also reflecting steady increases in financing across nearly all types of investors. So just to make it a little bit more complicated here, let me share what we call our spaghetti graph, or the Sankey diagram, which provides a snapshot of finance flowing from the sources or intermediaries of climate finance on the very left-hand side through the mix of financial instruments being used, finally the types of activities being financed. And our most recent landscape found that annual flows rose to $574 billion. And again, that is just in relationship a little to the 35 billion of green ODA that Frank has mentioned before. So 574 billion on average over the years of 2017 and 2018, representing a nearly 25% increase from the previous 2 years. And I'd like to just share 3 of the highlights of this work. The first, and again, this is why ODA is so important, and the public sector remains the engine behind the overall climate finance architecture. We found in our most recent update that 52% of climate finance flows are from public resources, including from the governments, development finance institutions, public funds, and state-owned enterprises. What also is important is the majority of the money was raised and spent in the same country, and that confirms the strong domestic preference of investors, which we have identified also in our previous year's landscape reports. But it also highlights the importance of domestic frameworks for attracting investment. And the third point, just I do want to make, and again, it comes a little bit back to what Frank said as well, is the vast majority of finance, actually 93% of all the financial flows that we can track at the moment, flows to mitigation activities. Adaptation finance at the moment that we can track. And again, there's also data gaps, but they stand at 5% only of the overall global finance that we can track that is really addressing climate action. And there are adaptation finances even at the risk of declining in the near term due to the impact of COVID-19 and also at the uneven vaccine rollout. So I think ODA is really critical to ensuring that financing adaptation in particularly highly climate vulnerable developing countries will continue. And again, these are countries that many of them face very high debt burdens as well and have limited fiscal space. So again, I think a real area where we need more action. Just very briefly, what I did want to share is looking at, again, specific actors across the landscape, is that public development banks will play a significant role in responding to the effects of the pandemic and in really helping to shift investment flows towards achieving the Paris Agreement and the SDGs more generally. We've seen in our work that they can also foster effective collaboration and dialogue amongst market actors, amongst governments and regulators to promote a long-term carbon neutrality and also inclusive growth. So I'd like to share just a little bit of where we are today by looking at one example, which is the International Development Finance Club, the IDFC, which is a leading group of 26 national and regional development banks, including the Korea Development Bank. But these banks are from all over the world, and the majority are active in emerging markets. Together, the IDFC members are the largest provider of public development finance globally, with $4 trillion in combined assets and annual commitments averaging more than $600 billion in the past 5 years. And we've been helping them with periodically mapping the member institutions' green finance contributions. And again, just to give you a few highlights that you can see also on this slide here, is that IDFC members reported total green finance commitments of almost 200 billion in 2019, apologies. And that represents an almost 50% increase from the previous years, even though it's still a little bit below the high point that they have reached in 2017. Green finance commitments are representing about 25% of total new commitments reported by members. And they have consistently been really increasing over the last years. They're consistently representing more than 1/5 of total IDFC investment since 2015. And climate finance, which is a subset of the overall green finance, consisting really to all activities related to mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and to adaptation to climate change, that accounted for about 95% of total green finance. Just a little bit more in terms of where the money goes from these development banks, where does it end up? And you can see on this slide here that the East Asia and the Pacific region again accounted for the largest share of commitments. That's at almost 70%, in accordance with the geographical distribution of total commitments and assets, and in line with the trends. Also on the global level, we've seen that IDFC member institutions committed 87%, so again, almost the high majority of green finance in their home countries. And again, I think this just shows the real importance of financial institutions in their own countries in order to ensure that there really is the right enabling environment and really understanding that you know very well your own investment climate. I do want to go a little bit away from the overarching picture of where we are to basically say that while it's obviously very positive that you can see in general increasing trends in climate finance over the last years, we are still falling far short of what is needed in order to achieve global climate and sustainable development goals. You can see here on this slide just a little bit the relations. We really need fast investment in order to keep global warming under the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. And just as 2 reference points of the needs, the IPCC suggests that we need between 1.6 and 3.8 trillion US dollars just in new climate investment for the supply side of the global energy system through 2015 if you want to keep within the 1.5 degrees target. And the Global Commission on Adaptation estimated an annual cost of $180 billion globally to adapt to the ongoing and future impacts of climate change. And again, that is in stark contrast to the 30 billion that we've been able to track up to now. But I think I want to bring it back to what Frank said before, really saying that the opportunity exists globally. Low carbon and resilient growth could deliver economic benefits of up to $26 trillion from now until 2013, and that's a conservative matter. So I think I would love very much to also kind of share with this group how we can really harness these opportunities, and then building off at some of the excellent examples and case studies that Frank has shared towards the end of his presentation. And just to show one example and one way in which we can increase global climate finance is through innovative business models and financing solutions that really can scale private investment. Private investment is critical if we want to get to the scale needed. We all know that public investment alone will not be sufficient, and it's more important than ever to use public money and public capital most effectively to really unlock other pools of capital. And so one example of how to come up with innovative solutions that can attract private capital is an incubator or accelerators like one that we are running at CPI, which is the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is a public-private initiative of experts in sustainable investment from governments, but also from development finance institutions, from investment banks, institutional investors, and other private sector institutions. And its goal is to unlock private investment in low carbon resilient development at scale. And it does so by crowdsourcing, by then developing and supporting the launch of new solutions that can tackle barriers in the market, and in this way really attract investment. And just very briefly, in a nutshell, what have we achieved through the lab? Since the lab started in 2014, we've developed and launched almost 50 financial instruments and business models that have mobilized almost $2.4 billion for concrete projects in emerging markets. And again, I think a few that Frank has mentioned before would fall under the types of models that we are trying to kind of develop and really help testing and piloting in order to get to scale, hopefully. But maybe let me just to close, and I know I'm running out of time as well, circle back a little bit to my initial point on how to establish a green and resilient recovery. And I think I'd like to share three final points here with you, as you see on this slide here. I think the first point is that we're seeing very clearly that good policies lead the way. They're key to resourcing a sustainable and resilient recovery. So green fiscal policies like pricing carbon or reforming fossil fuel subsidies or procurement policies and green budgeting more generally can be an important element in the government's COVID-19 response toolkit. Why is that so? This is because such approaches really support countries in removing inefficiencies in public expenditures and raising additional revenue, which can be directed both towards immediate relief measures, while also supporting medium to long-term sustainable recovery planning aligned with climate objectives. My second point is that it is clear in the wake of COVID, and I already said that we really need to use public finance even more wisely than ever before. With these competing demands on public finance and with rapid recovery needed, development financial institutions in particular have a major role to play. And we see that development banks and international financial institutions can help with strategy, they can support policy development, which is so important to attract investment, but they can deploy also a wide range of instruments to manage, to share, and to reduce risk, and they can convene relevant stakeholders and decision makers across the public and private sectors. And through these activities, they can greatly enhance what the private sector can do. So expanding their role in a post-COVID world is likely to be one of the cheapest and lowest risk ways to really get low-cost finance to the green recovery in climate action. And then my final point I think I'd like to close with is we certainly, I think, need to think a little bit bigger and see how we can really reset the whole financial system. I think now with the shocks to the financial system and the real economy worldwide, which much more clearly highlight that it is a time when we increasingly are seeing actors such as central banks and regulators also look to the next crisis, the climate crisis. So this is the moment where all financial institutions need to ultimately align their portfolios with a better future, a strong and inclusive, sustainable and a resilient future. And there is an urgent need to shift the entire financial system to better respond to and help reduce and manage both physical but also transition risks triggered by climate change, as well as to standardize some of the related disclosures. So I think just to close, I think we do have a real window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, a more resilient, or more sustainable future, targeting both the short-term recovery and the long-term structural changes aligned with such a sustainable, inclusive growth, and also strengthening society's resilience. However, not doing so really would pose a significant threat not only to the sustainable recovery, but also the world as we know it, given the looming climate crisis. I think we are risking at the moment closing that window, and some of the figures that Frank has shared with us have shown how we are falling behind, and also how tiny that the share of green ODA is related to the over trillions that are being spent on recovery measures. But I do believe that together we still can make it happen. And for this reason, again, I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation today, and hope to continue this with all of you, and really think about ways in which we can really help accelerate change towards a better future. I think with that, I'm going to stop here and hand back to you, Sujong. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. I always like to see the Euro landscape, the figure. It is really helpful for us to actually understand how we can trace the flow of the climate finance at the global level. Thank you. Now, I'd like to invite the next speaker, Mr. Stefan Klingberg, Director of the UNDP's Whole Policy Center. Stefan, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Good morning, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much again, Professor Chong, for this close collaboration and the invitation to contribute to this important event. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to cover is to discuss a bit with you why is green ODA, Official Development Assistance, important? What does green ODA mean? How have OECD countries responded so far to challenges of green ODA, and how the Republic of Korea can respond to this specific challenge? And I think it's good that I have the opportunity to repeat some messages. Maybe sometimes the nuance might be also a bit different. So let's go to the next slide, and this is just a reminder to you, and we are very aware about the climate change challenges, but I think in times of COVID-19 we have this kind of competitive situation that we have multiple challenges, and I think it's really important also to repeat it to the development cooperation community that COVID-19 related fall in emissions will not lead to CO2 concentration. So this is so this kind of climate change challenge will remain. Limitations or the limitation to 1.50% is not impossible, but it requires fundamental changes. So development cooperation is part of this huge international effort, and we all know that we are not on track. And just to highlight one aspect, we know from a joint exercise between UNDP and Oxford University that the majority of people in the world believe that climate change is a global emergency. And I think this is maybe today a bit the difference to the situation 5 or 10 years ago. So we have now really this kind of global understanding about the relevance of the climate change challenge. Next slide, please. This is just to indicate a bit the main rationale of why is the greening of development assistance necessary. Just a few main starting points. I think one is that sustainable development and climate change are closely interrelated. And I think what we are seeing, at least for the last few years, is that those different communities, the environment communities and the development cooperation communities are coming a bit closer together. But this kind of belief that those things are closely interrelated is really important. What is also important is to emphasize that from an economic perspective, it is very smart to address climate change. And I think we heard already a number of very illustrative examples in this regard, but this is also important for those ODA investments not in climate change, and also from an economic perspective, this is something what is very clever and smart. It is also very important to emphasize that we have a clear international commitment to address climate change challenges also via ODA. I think this is also something what needs to be re-emphasized. And last but not least, as a starting point for this kind of rationale why we need this greening of aid, climate change challenges exist to a large extent because of OECD countries, because of those providers of ODA. I think this is also quite important starting point. Next slide, please. This is just to indicate that ODA can be a quite significant enabler for green recovery, for climate action. I think we shouldn't overestimate what we can achieve with ODA. We heard already a number of illustrations that ODA is roughly 150 billion US dollar per year. This is something, but of course this is not everything. But in this regard, for developing countries, ODA can be a quite significant enabler. For 2018, we know that around 26% of bilateral programmable ODA was addressing climate action. I think some of the speakers addressed this challenge already, that this is probably not a situation where we should relax, but where we need to continue to push. Let me emphasize one aspect which was implicitly mentioned, but what is really important, I think it's important to see some or a number of activities explicitly addressing climate action. But at the same time, this kind of approach needs to be mainstreamed. So all activities from ODA need to make sure that those activities are green ODA activities. Also, those activities which are not explicitly trying to address climate change challenges. Next slide, please. This is just one fundamental rationale behind this kind of thinking, that we need to mainstream green ODA, to mainstream climate action. As we all know, we have those 17 SDGs, and what we all understand is that we have those sometimes separate communities pushing for specific SDGs. And I think it's nothing wrong about, pushing for a specific objective, but at the same time, I'm a strong believer that we can only overcome main global challenges if we integrate our activities. So if we do not understand how to overcome, for example, social protection challenges and how to bring together those issues with governance challenges, I think it will be quite difficult to address climate change issues. So in this regard, I think what we from UNDP are pushing for, together with other actors, of course, is this kind of SDG integration approach to make sure that everything will address climate change challenges, but also this kind of explicit approach. Thank you. Next slide. This is just to illustrate in how far G20 countries are addressing this kind of green recovery approach in the context of COVID-19. What you see here is those investments from G20 countries done until early February this year because of COVID-19. And what you can easily find out here is that the majority of investments, most investments are brown investments from G20 countries. And I think this is the main risk, that we continue this kind of situation from pre-COVID, that we still do not pay sufficient attention for the climate change challenges. Next slide, please. This is just to highlight again what was already mentioned, that the Korean New Deal with the Green New Deal is something what is important. It's good to see that Korea is one of the front runners together with the European Union, but we also have at least some developing countries pushing very much this kind of Green New Deal approach. We just recently had a very interesting event with examples from the European Union, with examples from the Republic of Korea, but also with examples from Rwanda, so one of the low-income countries. But this kind of role model example coming also from Korea is something what is really very important. And the announcement of government from the end of last year to go for carbon neutrality by 2050 is, of course, supporting this very much. Next slide, please. And this is just to indicate a bit entry points, how the Republic of Korea can try to address or emphasize this kind of green ODA approach in the future. I think, first of all, when it comes to the bilateral ODA approach, there is some potential to increase just the share of green ODA, Korean green ODA, to use the possibilities to mainstream climate change in all ODA engagements. I think this is probably the most important area. At the same time, we have multilateral cooperation supported by the Republic of Korea. And in this regard, we have a number of activities already ongoing where environmental international organizations are supported, or those activities of international organizations with a specific focus on climate change. This applies not at least to green platforms of multilateral development banks. And I would also emphasize here in this context the normative discourse and the role the Republic of Korea is playing and can play in the future, like this host role for the P4G summit at the end of May this year, a potential bid for the COP28 in 23. Those are really quite important opportunities for the Republic of Korea to show its own activities in this regard, but also to lead the way. Next slide. And yeah, this is just to emphasize that this kind of green growth approach of the Republic of Korea is, of course, the main influencer for the green ODA approach. And those things can really come together and provide this kind of synthesis approach that Korea's approach is also leading its own green ODA concept in the future. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the last speaker of this session, Dr. Rob Stowe of Harvard University. Ralph, floor is yours, and then we're gonna extend our session time a little bit more, so don't worry, you can speak as much as you want. Thank you very much. So Ralph, floor is yours again.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung, for the invitation. I'm trying to share my screen and I'm being told that it will stop the other screen sharing, which I assume is okay. Great. Thank you very much for the invitation, and also thanks to the co-hosting and organizing institutions and individuals for supporting this important conference as we begin implementing the Paris Agreement and continue to address climate change. I think the speakers before me have characterized green official development assistance more or less definitively, and I will not attempt to do more than that. I do want to look at building capacity for climate change policy in particular. And this builds on Barbara Buchner's first key ingredient on her last slide, right? Which was the importance of good policy. So I'm going to address assistance to emerging economies to build capacity for formulating and implementing public policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions primarily. So in the climate change world, that means mitigation policy or reducing emissions. It's important to note that public policy, which more or less equals government action, is essential, if not sufficient, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because climate change is a global commons problem. Now, I'm going to try to define that in 15 seconds, which is to say that there are damages that result from greenhouse gas emissions over decades and centuries, but the cost of those damages are not incorporated into the price of products and services produced by the emitters. Public policy internalizes those costs and provides an incentive to reduce emissions, and therefore public policy is absolutely essential, if not sufficient. Now, carbon pricing, which has been referenced by a couple of the speakers, is one cost-effective policy approach to reducing emissions, which means that through carbon taxes or emissions trading, governments can achieve particular emissions reduction goals at a less cost than through some other policies. Now I'm going to run through a few case studies, which I hope might engage our audience at what I'm looking at is a very late time and is late in the morning for you. These examples or case studies are not meant to be exclusive. And in fact, there may be examples from Korea, which I have not included because I am not an expert on Korea, and for that I apologize in advance. The Paris Agreement itself has two important institutional mandates for building capacity, in part to develop and implement good policy. There's the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. Now, policy is not mentioned in the Paris Agreement itself or the accompanying decision of the Conference of the Parties. However, the annual report of this mandate specifies that the PCCB is intended to bridge gaps between climate research and climate policy, and between climate policy and climate action. So this is one approach that the Paris Agreement itself puts forward. A second is the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency. And here, transparency in the language of the Paris Agreement, for those who may not be as familiar, means review, reporting, and before that, measurement of climate change emissions. Again, policy is not mentioned explicitly, but this Paris Agreement mandate is elsewhere specified as strengthening national institutions for transparency, related activities in line with national priorities. Now, there's another initiative which is related to the Paris Agreement, though not part of it per se, which is the Collaborative Instruments for ambitious climate action workstream. Now that's a mouthful. It's a program of the UNFCCC Secretariat, where the UNFCCC is the parent treaty to the Paris Agreement, if you will, intended to help emerging economy governments understand, formulate, and implement carbon pricing policies. And it does build on the Paris Agreement, and its purpose is, in fact, to help national governments produce new nationally determined contributions which are more ambitious, in part through incorporating carbon pricing, where, of course, the nationally determined contributions are the pledges that each government makes to reduce its emissions. So it builds on Article 11 of the Paris Agreement, which in fact addresses capacity building specifically, and also the decision accompanying the Paris Agreement, where we recognize the important role of providing incentives for emissions reduction activities through public policy is tacit here, including tools such as domestic policies and carbon pricing, so not so tacit. A number of national governments have supported what is fondly known as SIACA, also the Asian Development Bank, ASEAN, World Bank. And the initiative has conducted 5 regional workshops to help, again, emerging economy governments build capacity for developing and formulating, in this case, carbon pricing policy. Still going in a second phase and trying to structure a third phase. This is the cover sheet of a presentation on one of the workshops. Another case study is the World Bank's Partnership for Market Implementation, more recently known as Partnership for Market Readiness. So we've moved beyond readiness to actually implementing policy. And this is intended to assist participant countries to design, pilot, and implement explicit carbon pricing instruments aligned with always domestic development priorities. Bilaterally, I'm going to just cite one country at the risk of leaving out many others that have done a great deal, but Germany's ZIZ has done a great deal bilaterally to help build capacity for carbon pricing policy in particular, but also climate change policy more generally. The Global Carbon Market Project, which has run for several years, and then specifically a longer running project which has ended now to help China develop its own emissions trading system, which has now finally launched on February 1st. So quite recently. I would love to talk more about China's ETS and the importance of that set of policies, but of course we don't have time. Some reflections on these case studies. I'd say that the above examples are suggestive of a gradual move towards what I'm calling green policy ODA. So building capacity for climate change policy generally, mitigation policy more specifically, and I think it was Barbara who said that mitigation policy is the overwhelmingly larger part of climate finance. Now, it shouldn't necessarily be that way because adaptation is very important also. But as a matter of fact, that's the case, and carbon pricing policy in particular. Now, green policy ODA is about governments learning, which is required before doing, and doing here is reducing emissions again. Action is based on knowledge. Green policy ODA is very important in helping countries, national governments learn about options that are consistent with their interests and goals for formulating and implementing policy to address climate change, including, of course, carbon pricing. The Paris Agreement, of course, itself is often criticized as not being ambitious enough. And this is true. If you sum up the nationally determined contributions in the Paris Agreement, they're not nearly enough to achieve the temperature and other goals that we need to feel that we can be safe. But I would argue that this misses the point of the Paris Agreement, which is largely a forum for learning about or building capacity for mitigation and adaptation policy. Now, also technical processes, such as measuring the emissions of greenhouse gases, right? But it is at least partly about building capacity for good, as Barbara said, the importance of good public policy. This is true in Article 11, which is capacity building, of course. Article 13, which is the so-called transparency article, reporting and review, which provides feedback cycles for national governments to learn about what policies work and which don't. And that may differ, of course, depending on the country. Article 4 is the mitigation article. And we know that national governments have to submit a new pledge every 5 years. And the idea is that they'll learn how to do that better and more ambitiously. From the review from Article 13, there's a feedback loop there too. Someone, I'm very sorry, talked about feedback loops prior to me. It was Stefan, and they are indeed important. Finally, Article 6, which we don't have time to discuss, but which is, roughly speaking, the carbon pricing article, is also structured in such a way that those who participate, this is voluntary, of course, those who participate voluntarily in Article 6 can learn how to reduce emissions in a more cost-effective way over time. So green policy ODA, more generally, can be viewed as a set of modes of learning to address climate change more effectively. I am including a screenshot of a volume from a journal called Policy and Society, which is entitled Policy Learning and Policy Change, including in the environmental sphere. And if anyone wants the reference, I can send that to them. I hope this has been helpful to Korea, to the audience more generally. Thank you very much. My program.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for your presenting on the sort of the what are the main issues that we can share in general in the context of Paris Agreement implementation. There are important articles that we need to focus on in the context of the working together with the developing countries. Even if I would like to sum up the major points of this session, however, it seems like we are running out of time. So we will come back to these issues again in later sessions of today. Having said that, thank you very much for all the speakers in this session. All of your presentations are extremely helpful for the not only participants, also general audiences that are watching us actually on time here, to understand the issues. So having said that, I would like to conclude this session. Thank you very much.